All right, welcome to the Christy Mathewson-Plank Central Pennsylvania chapter of SABR, and our book club meeting this month will feature Only the Ball Was White by Robert W. Peterson. Those of you who, I have my copy ready right here, Only the Ball Was White. I also, just for grins, brought my copy of Pigskin by Mr. Peterson as well, which is also a wonderful book. Philip, since you're here, I have my copy of Black Stats Matter, which is wonderful. Thank you for writing that. It's a delightful book. If people haven't read that, next time you're in a bar argument about why Negro League stats should be included, along with the White League stats, this is tons of more ammunition than you'd ever need. It's a fantastic book.
Thank you, sir.
Just a couple of housekeeping duties before I turn it over. Just as you said, if you're not speaking at any given moment, please, consider muting your phone, however, or whatever you're joining on. But feel free to use the chat. I'll be monitoring the chat for questions and other issues, and I'm continuing to admit people. We have 20 people and one more that says joining that I just clicked. So we're cranking along nicely. Thank you all for coming, and I will turn it over to Ted Knorr of the Mathewson-Plank Chapter.
Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
and you see my slide, right?
Yes.
Good, thank you. Well, I want to welcome a few people before we begin, and then I have some slides, and then I'm going to shut up because the purpose of this is to hear what you guys have to say about one of the marvelous books of the last century. The first people I want to welcome are, unfortunately, Mr. Peterson is listening from a higher place. He will not be able to communicate, but Tom and Margie are with us today, and we're very happy to have you, and there may be some questions directed to the both of you. I asked Tom how old the two of you were in May of 1970, and he told me he was 10 and Margie was 8. During the week, of course, I've been with Bob extensively this week, and he tells me Tom was 11 and Margie was 9. So they're both saying the same thing. And obviously there was different perspectives there, but welcome the two of you. I then want to welcome, I'm sorry?
I said thank you.
Thank
you. You're welcome, Tom. Thank you. Now there's 7 other people I do want to welcome because these 7 folks were actually at the conference in 1998 in Harrisburg that Mr. Peterson keynoted. And the first person that I'm introducing is our 94-year-old town griot here in Harrisburg, Caleb Jackson. I hope he's in attendance. I'm kind of in the dark, but Caleb was there and instrumental bringing the first Malloy to Harrisburg in '98. Jim Overmeyer, I hope he's here. He was also at that first Malloy in '98, and he also served on the voting panel in 2006 that put 17 Negro Leaguers in the Hall of Fame. Michael Marsh.
Mr. Overmeyer is here today.
Mike Marsh was a presenter in 1998 on Wendell Smith, and he reprised that in 2023 in Detroit. So he's a 2-time Malloy Conference attendee. Singer Jr., this is my usual roommate at Malloy's. He's pictured here this year at our conference. He's in the pub, as you can see, and he's here. I don't have Ralph's picture, but Ralph and his late wife, I just heard yesterday that his wife is no longer with us, but Ralph is with us today. He was also at that first conference. Paul DeBono, I'm hoping he shows up because he was instrumental at that first conference in me finding Paul Dixon's grave. We were looking for raps. Oh, and this guy was also at that very first conference. Right. In
You were
19...
never that young, Ted.
I'm sorry?
You were never that young, Ted.
Yeah. In 1966, when Mr. Peterson pitched this book to Prentice Hall, none of the following resources, institutions, opportunities, events, and pastimes were in existence. There was no Negro League Baseball Museum, no SABR, and more importantly for his topic, no SABR Negro League Research Committee. There were no Negro Leaguers in Cooperstown, and depending on when he took the assignment, such things as putting Negro Leaguers in the hall might not even have been on the radar. Ted Williams makes his talk July 25th, I think, of 66. There were no Black managers. The Negro League reunions in Greenup, Kentucky had yet to begin. Bingo Long and the Traveling All-Stars hadn't been written yet. And obviously Barry Gordy hadn't put the picture out yet. There was no Jerry Malloy research conferences, and 99% of the existing Negro League literature was in existence. So with such limited sources, how could Mr. Peterson produce Only the Ball Was White? Well, this is how. On August 8th, 1998, and unfortunately, I don't think I was going to play just a minute, but I don't think it's a good idea to try it because so far I've failed every time. So I don't think that will be able to be done today. However, I don't know if Jacob's here, but I've given it to SABR. This is Larry Lester's product. We owe Larry a debt of gratitude for having this recording. And I want SABR to put it fittingly in their 1998 Harrisburg conference area, which is almost has nothing there, but this 27-minute talk would be spectacular. But I apologize, I won't be able to sample it today. Okay, Mr. Peterson told us baseball behind the color line is not just Black history, it is American history. These are the sources that he did use in the 3 years in which he crafted the book. He lived about an hour from the New York Public Library. So that enabled exposure for him to Saul White and then two African-American 20th century authors, Doc Young and Edwin Bancroft Henderson, and also a few biographies on Page and Campanella. Other than Saul White, none of these really focused on the Negro Leagues. Young's book is about African Americans crossing that color line, beginning with Jackie. So there was a lot there. There was, however, the Black press, and the New York Public Library had preeminent access. And Mr. Peterson used the Chicago Defender, Pittsburgh Courier, Baltimore Afro-American, and the New York Age, and no doubt others, but these are the four principal ones. The other avenue that Mr. Peterson took, and he owed a debt of gratitude to Lawrence Ritter. The Glory of Their Times is a pioneering baseball oral history that Mr. Peterson considers the greatest baseball book of all time. And in Only the Ball Was White, you can see time and again, these are the players he spoke to: Roy Campanella, Buck Leonard, Judy Johnson, and on, finishing with the Old Ball Players Club of Chicago, which was instrumental in hooking them up with a lot of these guys. So while Mr. Peterson did not have the vast array of sources and resources that we have now, he found enough to put out this remarkable breadcrumb of a book. Now I'm going to just give you two quotes from the book, two of the more famous quotes, and then I'm getting ready to shut up. Tracing the course of the organized Negro Leagues is rather like trying to follow a single black strand of spaghetti through a ton of spaghetti. The footing is infirm, and the strand has a tendency to break off in one's hand and slither back into the amorphous mass. And then there's this one. Negro baseball was at once heroic and tawdry, a gladsome thing and a blot on America's conscience. Now, the book comes out May 8th, 1970, and in short order, look at what happens to those missing sources. On August 9th of 71, Satchel Paige is inducted, and 36 more have been inducted since as Negro Leaguers. The day after Paige's induction, Bob Davids, with 16 other statisticians, found SABR right there in Cooperstown. And shortly thereafter that, the Negro League Committee was founded. It was one of the very first committees that they organized. There was 4. 3 years later, Frank Robinson is hired in October of 74, debuting in 75, as the manager of the Cleveland Indians. Bingo long. The book is published in 73 and the movie comes out in 76. In July of 1979, celebrating a Greenup, Kentucky local, Clint Thomas, a group of Negro League players and authors and others began to have reunions. 1991, the Negro League Baseball Museum opens. 1994, I hope John Herson is in the audience. The Appa Game Company issued its wonderful 20 great Negro League team set. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that hopefully in 2025, Appa will be issuing another 20 teams celebrating Negro League baseball. And finally, in August of 1998, the Jerry Malloy Negro League Conference, with our spectacular keynoter, debuted in Harrisburg. Okay, just to stimulate some conversation, this is how the book is laid out. It's 404 pages in my paperback. 254 are, prose, divided into 4 sections, all named after Negro spirituals. And then there's 3 appendixes. I list 4 because I see the inspiration for the 4th appendix in the book. But these appendixes were really the only source for league standings, East-West All-Star games, and a complete list of, I don't know, maybe 3,000, I never counted, Negro League players, executives, and managers. It was 20 years or more until other sources were around for such. Okay, now, in order to stimulate conversation, and I hope Caleb is here, I just want to let him know, I will be calling on him first if he's here. I have 2 witnesses just to sort of set the tone. The first is Dave Malarcher, and I thank Margie Peterson for this. Malarcher was, of course, instrumental with Peterson in speaking about the book and witnessing, and he was also one of the first to have a copy. So he wrote this letter about 2 weeks before publication, and this is what he said. The book is all more than marvelous, more than wonderful. It is astoundingly magnificent. And then he offers this prediction that I think was correct in its content, but unfortunately wrong in its judgment of these 2 prize judges. It is my prediction that only the ball was white will win for you the Nobel Peace Prize and the Pulitzer Prize. My second witness will be Larry Lester. Larry is the longest serving chairman of SABR's Negro League Committee, the winner of the Bob Davids Award in 2017, and he wrote this in an essay in 2015 for the National Pastime Museum in Cleveland. The seismic impact of this book shook the baseball world like the archaeological discovery of the Lucy fossil in 1974. Its aftershocks lifted black baseball from the abyss with untold stories and unheard voices. It was the baseball book that changed my life. Larry Lester speaking. It was like diving into a genie bottle, meeting the Wizard of Oz, and getting a heart, a brain, and enough courage to research this dark chapter. So, I have about 60 pictures that I'm going to scroll through, but it's my hope that you folks in attendance now are going to carry the day. So I need to somehow be able to, boy, a little advice, RJ, how can I get my screen smaller? Okay, well, RJ, I guess you're going to have to call on people. I'd like Caleb, if he's there, to just offer a few words about his experience in '98.
Not seeing Mr. Jackson with us. Let me see if I can do anything with regard to, because I'd like people to see who's speaking, but I'd also like to see the pictures you'll be scrolling through. So let me see if I can split the screen. In the meantime, feel free to unmute yourselves and join in as the spirit moves you.
I'd like folks to raise their hand, and that way we can see.
That? Okay.
Yeah, and see, I can't see for some reason. I don't have that bar at the bottom.
Got it. Okay, I'll keep an eye out for that then.
And Tom and Margie, if Caleb's not here, might want to go first.
I am not seeing Mr. Jackson.
Okay.
Sure, I'd be happy to talk a little bit. This is Tom Peterson.
And I'll fill in, but he's happy to talk about our dad, how he came to do this and what it was like growing up with him doing it.
So first of all, the first thing I want to do is to say thank you to everyone who was part of the Jerry Malloy conference in 2017. If you were there, you may remember myself, my sister, and my mother were there, and particularly my mother was extremely thrilled with the reception and with the excitement of the day. I used to try to get her to do a little exercise. She was 95 years old, and I tried to get her to do exercise. And we normally go out and walk for maybe 100 yards, and I'd consider that a big success. Well, the next day, she wakes up and she's so excited she does close to half a mile. So I was thrilled with that. She was so happy about the Malloy conference. So my sister and I are going to tell you as best we can what we know about how he came to write the book. But keep in mind that was almost 60 years ago. I was 12 at the time, and she was 10 when the book came out. And neither of us are black baseball experts, but we'll do what we can. So my dad was born in Warren, Pennsylvania. He was 4 when the Great Depression happened, and his father died when he was 6. His mom took in washing for the neighbors, and he did odd jobs. For one thing he did was as a pin boy. And back in those days, they didn't have electronic pin setter things at bowling alleys. So the person would bowl the ball down a couple times, and he would set up the pins by hand. He played baseball nonstop, played in high school, and then in the Navy during World War II. And he did play against black teams that barnstormed through Warren. He went to college on the GI Bill and played baseball there as well. When he left college, as you know, he became a newspaper man, working as a reporter and an editor. He became the assistant night editor of the New York World Telegram, working nights and sleeping during the days. That paper went out of business in 1966, so he decided to become a freelance writer. Over the years, he did a ton of work for the Boy Scouts. I always joked with him, if you are familiar with the Boy Scouts, the Boys Life magazine, there was a feature in there called
Pedro the Answer Donkey.
Pedro the Answer Donkey, yes. So he was Pedro the Answer Donkey for a while. Kids would write in with letters and ask him questions, and he would reply. And so whenever he would he would object to an editor changing his copy or something like that, I would tell him, you'd think they'd have a little more respect for the literary stylings of Pedro the Answer Donkey. He thought that was pretty funny. He wanted to do a book back in the mid-60s, and he did remember the All Black teams barnstorming through, and as I said, he played against them. And he did a little research and discovered that nothing really had been published on it since Saul White's book in 1907. So he drew up a proposal, got rejected, and then got accepted by Prentice Hall. Got a $3,000 advance, $1,500 initially, $750 when the manuscript was half done, and $750 when it was completed. He worked about 30 hours a week doing freelance work, for the Boy Scouts or whatever, and then about 30 hours a week on the book. I think you may know, he spoke with Roy Campanella, who had a liquor store in Harlem, who mentioned Buck Leonard was in North Carolina and Judy Johnson was a scout for the Phillies. They in turn turned him on to other players, and he spoke to about 12 players. The book was positively reviewed, and it's still in print now 55 years later, as I'm very happy to say. Never was a bestseller. And one of the things was Jim Bouton's book, Ball Four, was published around the same time. And of course, that was a very, earth-shattering book. Just two quick stories, if I may. The first about Larry Ritter. So Larry Ritter offered my dad a $5,000 loan, which he assumed would never be paid back. But my father declined that. And Larry knew that my father couldn't afford to travel to St. Louis to interview Cool Papa Bell. So Larry did, and showed up at our house with a tape of that interview, which was an incredible gift. And the other thing I remember very fondly was when Buck Leonard was inducted in 1972, our family went to the ceremony, and the Hall of Fame had a reception for the Black players, and we got to go. And I remember talking to Buck Leonard for about 20 minutes, and he could not have been nicer. He was just so nice, just a nice guy. I can't remember now, 60 years later, what we talked about, but I'm just still amazed that he, would spend that much time at a reception honoring him, talking to a 13-year-old. What a guy.
The only thing I was going to add is that we sent Ted a copy of the Dave Malarcher letter that he had written to my father after Dave had seen the book. And it was so important to my parents, but even more so to my mom, because she, they had to skimp pretty much during the time that he was doing this research and the time he was writing, because, the other money wasn't coming in. And so the legacy was so much more important to my mother than the money that would never is still coming in, but not we never struck it rich. The one thing though I told Ted was that my brother used to say, because the Dave Malarcher letter was so eloquent and so effusive, my brother used to say that if our house ever caught fire, my mother would grab the Dave Malarcher letter and then my brother and I. So that's any questions we'd be happy to answer, but we can't tell you how important it is to our family that what Ted is doing and what the rest of you have done in furthering the whole field of the Negro Leagues. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions for our two guests.
One hand is up, Mr. Glenn Basie.
Yes. Well, thank you, Ted, and thank you, Tom and Margie, for being here. It's a wonderful treat to be able to examine the sources of this legendary book. It's a book that was so needed and filled its place so well that it launched the fascination and interest that has propelled Black baseball researchers to the point where we have gotten not only the recognition in the Hall of Fame that we were striving for back when I joined SABR, but we have gotten the recognition of the statistics and into the major league oeuvre. And it's just, it's amazing to me. I remember that in 2003, when I went to my first Malloy conference, I met Mr. Peterson and I got him to sign my copy of the book. And that meant so much to me. It lifted my heart. And I was doing a presentation at that one, and I ended my presentation with the phrase, I regret that I missed the golden age of Negro League baseball, but I believe that I'm living in the golden age of Negro League baseball research. And I've talked with Ted about that comment since then, and we agree that it has continually enhanced. It has gotten better and better, and I think we owe a lot of this to Mr. Peterson. Thank you.
A couple other hands up. Who do we have? Karen Holleran.
Hi, I was wondering about the cemeteries. Have you found that there's problems as far as Black, the African American cemeteries for baseball players? Are they easily accessible?
If I may, I've found them easily accessible. The few that I've been to, they're more identifiable now, thanks to SABR's cemetery folks that raise money to put markers. So many of the graves, black and white, Major League and now Negro Major League, were unmarked. Josh Gibson's. Now it's been marked for quite a while now, but it really wasn't a question of status as much as early concern, or they're so the graves, and they're a wonderful place to go. I'm so happy here in Harrisburg we have a half a dozen Negro League ball players' graves, and I do go to them often. I'm sure there's others here. If Mr. Overmeyer's here, he's probably been in as many as anybody.
Okay, thank you.
Michael Marsh also had a hand up.
Hi, good morning. Thank you. Can everybody hear me?
We
Yes.
can.
Oh, great. Thank you. Tom and Margie, I cannot overstate my gratitude for listening to your presentation today. I met your parents at the first Malloy conference back in 1998, and it remains one of the thrills of my history doing research into Black baseball, and especially Wendell Smith. I bought this copy in 1994 when a coworker at the Sun-Times reminded me about Satchel Paige and Bullet Joe Rogan. I bought the book and I enjoyed reading the history of the players, but I was really happy that your father had mentioned Wendell Smith, the Black sports writer, and that inspired me to research Wendell Smith's life and work. So I have a deep gratitude to your father for producing this book. I do have one question. You mentioned the role that a couple of Black ball players played in the research. Did your father reach out to the old school Black sports writers for any research assistance?
As I understand it, he reached out to a group called the Old Ball Players of Chicago, and they were very helpful in contacting several players in Chicago. I don't know that, if this is a different group, I don't know that he did.
Oh, no, thank you. I'm asking about the Black sports writers, like
I
Wendell
see.
Smith, Lacey, Doc Young. Did he get any help from those sports writers?
I'm not aware of that. He did his research, the newspapers. He would go to the libraries and research the Black press, and I don't know that he talked with any of those folks. No.
Okay, thank you.
And of course, this was before the internet, so so everything was going to the libraries and finding addresses, and as he says in the intro to the book, the more recent issues, is that one player would hook him up with a different player, and then that player would say, oh, I know the widow of this player, and it was all word of mouth. It was nothing like it is today.
Oh, thank you.
Sure.
What do you got to say, Mr. Overmar?
Yes.
We can't hear you.
Yes, now you can. Good morning. Well, Bob's book was the first one I read on the Negro Leagues, about which I knew practically nothing in the mid-'80s. My wife convinced me to start researching Effa Manley, and little did she know, or I know, where that was going. And it was a whole new world. And I found out a lot about Effa Manley and the Eagles and all of that. I stumbled over a lot of other players that I wrote about later, particularly Frank Grant, who turned out to have been born and raised practically in my backyard, and nobody in my backyard knew anything about him anymore. We fixed that too. Yeah, Bob was he was at the book signing of the first edition of the Effa Manley book. I ran into him 2 or 3 times after that, a real gentleman. But the thing that, his work lived on. And I think this is probably still the case for anyone who's still researching. All of those, he would go around and interview these players. And this is in the mid-'60s. And God knows the size. He probably had a tape recorder the size of a small suitcase, like what we're used to now.
Yes, he did.
Yeah, reel to reel, probably. And all of those tapes were digitized, and the Hall of Fame has them. And for a modest sum, they will sell them, copy them, and sell them to you. And they're just amazing to listen to, because he's asking all these questions. And my first response listening to him is, well, I know the answer to that question. Why is the answer? Oh, right. No one knew the answer to that question except the ball players then. And now he's got it for history. It's like you think about like an explorer centuries ago going to the Sahara or to the Amazon or somewhere and finding out all this stuff we didn't know. And that's Bob Peterson's contribution to what we're doing today.
If I may jump in just for a second, one of the things that was so important to us is that my mother knew some of these things before she died about how the researchers like you guys brought out so much more. And one of the most important things that happened to her in her last year of life was she got to go to the conference, the Jerry Malloy conference that Ted put together, and meet all, a number of researchers, probably some of you as well, and even a couple relatives of some of the old the old Black players. And it was she could live for 6 months on that. It was so important to her that this book last beyond our father's lifetime, and that it influenced it. It wasn't a bestseller, and it still gives us royalties, but it never made anybody $1 million. But the fact that recognition and that his work had made that kind of impact was better than gold to her. So thank you all for what you did, especially Ted, who, as I said, made her last year of life. It was the most important thing that happened to her that year.
Wow. Donna Muscarella, and then Glenn after that.
So, Margie and Tom, thank you very much for being here. One of my favorite memories of my dad is just sitting around and listening to him tell me baseball stories and teach me about the game. I was wondering if you have any specific stories that you wouldn't mind sharing about things that he discovered and how he shared them with you guys. Was it over dinner? Was it whatever? I'd love to hear what you'd have to say.
Tom, you want to add to this? I think you're muted.
Let's try it again. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yep.
now
Okay.
we can.
So he was not, my mother was a very social person. She loved to be, to go to parties, to, hang out with people and talk and talk and talk. My father was much less so. So, he would certainly talk about his work, I'm sure. But again, this was years and years ago. I can't say I remember anything specifically. I know that I remember it being, a lot of work. As I said, he was doing 30 hours a week in his regular job, doing freelance writing, and then 30 hours a week on the book. So I think it was, a lot of work that he was doing. I can't say that I really know anything about any specific stories, or at least remember any specific stories, other than I think he enjoyed the work greatly. He enjoyed meeting the players. I think he enjoyed doing the work in the libraries. So this was a passion of his. But maybe Margie can help us out, but I really don't have anything to offer.
The one memories that I do have of the time and afterwards was there would be people coming to our house for different like dinner with one of the maybe a widow of one of the players or something like that for a little while. It was obviously there weren't a lot of people that were able to do that, but I do remember in fact, one of the people who was at Ted's conference, at the Jerry Malloy conference in 2017, was the daughter of either daughter or granddaughter of a player. And she talked about, my meeting my parents. And it was
Max Manning's daughter, Belinda Manning.
And that was huge to my mom. But my dad, as Tom said, my father was a wonderful father. I wouldn't trade him for $1 million, but he was kind of a stoic Swede, and he was, I'll give you an example. He loved his family and was wonderful to us, but he was also very honest father. And I used to write a column for a newspaper here in Allentown, the Morning Call, and I would send my parents the column before it ran in case they had wanted to, you know, copy edit it or whatever. And I usually look to him and my mother for approval of the column. And my mother almost always gushed, you know, oh, this is the greatest thing ever written of all time, blah, blah, blah. My father, if he didn't like a column, he would just say, do you have anything else? And that was the cue that that wasn't very good, but he was the honest parent, I guess you could say. And our mother was the cheerleader. And I'm glad I had both, you know. And so my mother was always inviting, you know, people that he researched with to dinner or to different things at our house. And so when we were kids, people would be coming, you know, we would meet some of the people, but I couldn't unfortunately tell you now who all they were, because it's, you know, 60 years later or so.
Thank you.
Thanks. Before we have 4 people with their hands up, we'll get to all of you. I wanted to address a question in the chat. Jordan Dunlap asked, what was your father's favorite Negro League team to research? Just to make sure that this gets into the recording, Tom Peterson wrote, I don't believe he had any. He loved baseball, but had no favorite team. I think he was fascinated by the history and loved doing the research and especially meeting the players. I think he appreciated all of them. As for me, Buck Leonard was my favorite. Before we go to the people whose hands are up, Mr. Peterson, did you want to say anything further about that? Or?
No, that's fine.
Okay. Glenn, I think you were next.
Yes, I just wanted to say that one of the remarkable things about the book is that it's still the place to start. When you are the first person on the scene and you try to create the story of what happened when there's so few sources to go to discover what happened, it would be certainly acceptable and understandable that there would be mistakes made. And I'm sure that somebody who is picking through things could find stuff. But the essence of the book is so remarkably right on that it stands the test of time, where if somebody were to come to me now and say, where should I start to research this? Clearly where we would begin. You know, I would say only the ball was white, and then we'll move on to, you know, the contributions of Mr. Overmeyer, all of the people here or not here that have made this such a golden era. But that book still retains its quality. It was so well researched and well thought out, and that I just think is remarkable for the launching. You know?
Yeah, thank you. It's very nice of you to say. You know, he wrote the book in 1970 and then went on to do different things. He was freelance writing. He was on the school board in my town. He coached baseball. He coached my baseball teams. So he got involved in other things. He did then do a chapter in Shades of Glory, which was published, I think, in 2005 or 2006, somewhere in there. But he, you know, was not an expert in the same way that you folks probably are for a good portion of his life. He just did the first one. And I think he did it very well.
Yes.
All right. Jack Houston, I think you're up.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone. And this is Jack Houston from Williamsport, Pennsylvania. And also you can see that Lou Hunsinger and Beth England are joining me today from Williamsport. And we just want to give recognition that, you know, Lou Hunsinger with Ted for their contribution to the Malloy Conference, but really Lou Hunsinger's research and his contribution to minor league baseball is influenced a lot by Bob's book, and then that led to what would be the creation of our SABR chapter here in Williamsport, the Jimmy Sebring George Stovey chapter. And so it's in our short time, 3 years, it's a celebrated chapter. And we've looked at, thanking Bob in his book for the recognition of George Stovey, a Williamsport Negro player, and he still holds the record 36 wins in the International League as, his fireball left pitcher in that league. But, and Ted, thank you for coming to Williamsport. It was one of our celebrated conferences here. Over 80 people attended for your presentation about the Negro Leagues. So just from Williamsport, we want to say hello to everyone. And Ted, Marge, and Tom, thank you for today. And the book really had a great influence for our continued research and our presentations here at the Williamsport chapter. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jack. Carl Lindholm, you're up, and Karen Holleran, you're on deck.
Thank you. Greetings from here in beautiful Vermont. 70 degrees today. Mostly I have a testimonial. This is a first edition. I remember being in Presque Isle, Maine, and seeing the book on the shelf and saying, "My goodness, I should know about the Negro Leagues." I was a baseball obsessed kid and played baseball in college. And this is truly, and it's been described as such, a seminal book. It was the first to really, to take seriously and do the kind of research that your dad did. And it spawned, of course, all this other research. It's truly seminal for me. So it was a wonderful book, and it started a passion. I've been able to, I'm retired from teaching now at Middlebury College, and I was able to teach in the American Studies program 2 different baseball classes in that curriculum. And the first was kind of a general class called Baseball, Literature, and American Culture. And I would treat the Negro Leagues as a section of that class, and it just kept getting bigger and bigger. So I ended up being able to teach over a number of years, of course, on the Negro Leagues. I called it Baseball Segregation in America. And for a long time, after the colon, it would be Baseball's Negro Leagues. After a while, you had to be careful using the word Negro. So I called it eventually Baseball and Race. In the first class, I would say this is a class on the Negro Leagues, and you may use the word Negro as long as you use it as an adjective. And they learned how to do that. But it was a wonderful experience teaching the Negro Leagues. And the book itself, the best gift for me was actually on page 57 and 58. He describes something that he picked up from Saul White's 1907 history. And it was that there was a challenge to the color line by a player from Harvard named William Clarence Matthews. And because I'm in the Northeast, he also played 1 season of professional baseball in the Vermont League. And so the research was fairly easy for me. Your dad, Peterson, suggested that it was probably John McGraw that was interested in signing in 1905. Actually, Peterson says it's 1906. It turns out it was 1905 when a team was interested in signing Matthews. And it was suggested that it was John McGraw who had an antipathy that was well known to the color line. But I was able to go to the Boston Public Library and crank out those microfilm work and discovered that it was actually the Boston team in the National League, the Boston Nationals, later the Braves. And for me, that's most of the writing that I've done on baseball has been on William Clarence Matthews, and he's recognized now, a picture in the Hall of Fame and a number of other places. And so this book to me opened my eyes. It gave me a reason to continue to follow baseball with a passion and a kind of historical academic way. So it was so I just would say this is a testimony. It was a great gift. And the only question I might have is, you've talked quite a bit about this. You were young when this book was being written, and you talked about your mom as the extrovert and your dad a stoic Swede. I had a dad who was a stoic Swede too. he unfortunately, perhaps from his perspective, he produced a garrulous son. So a stoic seed, doesn't always have stoical sons and daughters. But were you able to? Did he express what he was doing was so new? It was so groundbreaking. He probably wasn't aware at the time it was this. Probably was, but were you able to share were there eureka moments? Did he express an excitement about the kind of work he was doing and with an awareness that nobody else was doing it?
So I don't think during the time when he was working on it, he was aware. I think he was trying to put together a history of Black baseball that was something that no one else had done. I think he liked that idea, and of course it was marketable. He was very much, he did not write for free.
Right.
So he didn't make a lot of money off of this book, but he wanted it to be a commercial success. So I don't think that he was doing it, he was aware of it at the time. I think once it was published, or once he was maybe at the end of his writing of the book, I think he was aware that it was as much sociological as it was sports history, and it would be an important book. So I would say the answer is yes, but probably not right away.
So he didn't say, "Gather round, children, I have a story to tell you" every night?
He
when
did
came
not,
home
no.
from the library?
No.
Well, and he was, I call him a stoic Swede. He was a very, I don't mean to make him sound like he was a cold fish. He was a wonderful father.
The word Negro.
But he was very honest and factual, and he cared deeply about his work. He cared deeply about his family and his community. And I think he was informed by his, he lost his father when he was 6 years old. He was, had to, help support his mother. He understood, he could have empathy for other people, and understood that, and was fascinated by history. So I think that was, I'm not sure. I mean, he was delighted that the book lives on. But my mother was the promoter.
Thank you.
Before Karen goes with her question, I wanted to acknowledge on the chat, John Groff points out that they have Robert Peterson's year of birth is 1925. Is that correct? And are there any plans to observe the 100th anniversary of his birth? And Ted put in the comments, that is correct. I like that thought. So I just wanted to make sure that was in the recording.
Oh, okay. I had a question about women in baseball. I know that a lot has been done with men in baseball, and only the ball was white. But what about women and their role?
Well, I assume there have been books written about and of course the film, the film, I think within the last 10 years or so, that was about women, the women's league playing. But you'd probably know more about that than I do.
Well, and there were 3 women in the Negro Leagues, if I'm not mistaken.
Mm-hmm. That came up a little bit at the Women in Baseball Conference. I can't remember the name of the presentation, but the Women in Baseball Conference a couple of weeks ago. Tony Stone, Mamie Johnson, and I'm drawing a blank on the third person. But
Bonnie Morgan.
Oh, thank you.
I just wondered if anybody had done anything else with women in baseball.
I'll say that the Women in Baseball Conference is one of the better. I attended virtually, and it was a wonderful conference. So.
Yeah, I was there too. It was really good. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Anybody else who wants to add a comment?
RJ, Yeah, I don't want to interrupt this flow of talk, so I just want to add one thing. I think I have found the ability to broadcast sound. So when we do simmer down with questions, I think we can finish with our walkout music, Mr. Peterson's uh, speech to the convention in 1998. I'm not ready for that yet. I see Eddie's here. Anyone who has something else to add, let's do that. But when we run out of stuff, I think I can play Mr. Peterson's talk.
Okay. And it is 11 o'clock, but we are not on there's no clock in baseball or here, so
I'd like to say something if I may.
fire away.
I got interested in Negro Leagues baseball decades ago, and the most prominent book by far in the discussions that I could find, which were limited at that time, was Only the Ball Was White. In biblical research, there's a lot of talk about a Q source or a Q document that may have preceded the synoptic gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that may have been a source for all three of those texts. And I think that Only the Ball Was White is essentially the Q document of Negro Leagues research. It's the foundation stone, certainly upon everything that I've done. My book quotes Robert Peterson on the first page of the first chapter. It was startling to me combing through Negro League's reference works when I was writing Black Stats Matter, that Peterson was the one guy who was always mentioned. He'd always be somewhere in the pages. He'd always be somewhere in the footnotes. He'd always be somewhere in the resources consulted. And the remarkable thing to me is that it continues to be true. This is 2024, and here we are talking about this book and hearing all these testimonials from professional writers and researchers and people in the field as to how important not just Robert Peterson's example, but Robert Peterson's living body of work is even today. And I personally may never have discovered the field if it hadn't been for Bob Peterson's work. The focus of my writing in Black Stats Matter and elsewhere is that I have thought since the 1980s that Negro League stats were 100% equivalent to Major League stats. And Robert Peterson's writing, along with John Holloway and Don Ragosin and a couple of other people, but again, Peterson was the cornerstone, caused me to just take at face value these comments that I would read in the black press, because we've heard in this conversation about Wendell Smith and Doc Young, and especially for me, Sam Lacey, who's just a fountain of information on black baseball. Unfortunately, a lot of his writing survives. But they would make these comments like, for example, that Josh Gibson and Buck Leonard were the black Ruth and Garrick. And in the 80s, thanks largely to the documentary work done by Robert Peterson and people influenced by Robert Peterson, I just assumed that was true. And it informed everything that I did from that point forward. It informed my interest in the subject. It informed my desire to dig and try to potentially come up with some proofs of that idea that black and white statistics were equal. And now, of course, Major League Baseball itself is embracing the concept. And I don't think any of that would have happened without Bob Peterson. And so, in addition to being a well-written work, and I'm pleased to see that his descendants seem to have acquired also the gift of verbosity and clear communication. But in addition to being real well written, it's a gold mine of information and the fountain, the source of the Mississippi, the starting place for everything that we do. I would never have met any of the people in this chat if it hadn't been for Bob Peterson. I, for one, am grateful the book exists. It's still a standard reference work for me. And that's what I have to say.
Before you run, Philip, I just showed some pictures of a semi-pro ball player named Peterson, Bob Peterson. The question comes to my mind, any relation to another excellent semi-pro ball player from the 40s, Woody Peterson?
For those of you who don't know, I presented at the Malloy Conference in June this year's on my grandfather, who did play semi-pro baseball and who had the highest possible opinion of Black players. He had seen Ruth play, and Cobb and Speaker and Ted Williams and all the greats you can think of. And when I asked him who the greatest player he ever saw was, he didn't hesitate for me. He said Willie Mays. He said he brought power to the he brought power, he brought speed, he brought defense. And he told me there were others who could do those things as well as Willie Mays, but no one could do all three as well as Willie Mays. And he didn't have any hesitation in saying that. And that, again, had a big influence on me. As far as that specific reference, I'm not aware of any other related Peterson who plays baseball. But if you would be obliged to send me anything that you might have that I could chase, I'd be more than happy to track it down.
That's Tom and Margie. If I can give you Philip's contact information, or you can send me something and we can nail that down. Philip's grandfather and your father were both excellent players. So we'll put Philip to work.
All right, I will happily send contact information. I think it's really unlikely. My grandmother was born in Sweden, and her husband was conceived in Sweden and born in the United States. So and they didn't have a large family besides that, but it's certainly possible.
In the chat, James Overmeyer points out that Mr. Peterson also wrote an excellent book on early basketball, Cages to Jump Shots. I mentioned Pigskin earlier. This got me looking at Mr. Peterson's bibliography, and 9 books, but quite a range. Crime in the American Response, South Africa and Apartheid, which was written in 1975. Book on space, from Gemini to the Moon and beyond. I mean, there's quite a lot of range in those 9 books, and ahead of his time in a couple of those categories. So very interesting. I'll have to look up a couple of those. So all right, anything else before we try the audio?
I actually just have a quick question for Donna Muscarella, if she's there. I see you have Hinchcliffe Stadium in your background. Are you involved with that museum at all? It's a fabulous museum.
I am.
University.
I am somewhat involved with the museum. I live less than 11 miles away from Hinchcliffe, and started doing some educational started giving some educational offerings back during the pandemic about Hinchcliffe, and as a result, have developed quite a great relationship with Jessica Cameron Bush and Dave Kaplan, who are heading up that museum. As a matter of fact, I am the new chair of the SABR Elysian Fields chapter, and we're working with them on trying to offer some programming there. It is a wonderful museum. Jessica's doing a great job of getting the word out about the history of the place, and I'm thrilled that there's something more than just the building now restored, which is wonderful in and of itself, but something of a more educational nature that allows people to learn about the tremendous history of the place.
Yeah, I attended a Jackals game this summer and was just blown away by the museum. It was spectacular.
Yeah, Yeah, and there's more to come. And Jessica's got some really amazing ideas. We're starting, I believe December 2nd is the first one. She's getting requests for people to go out to different community organizations and offer educational programming about Hinchliffe Stadium. So I'm going to be doing that for the museum. The first one is December 2nd. So it's definitely piquing people's interest, and I'm really excited about what the future holds.
Terrific. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Bedford, do you have
Hey.
anything to say?
Well, I'd just like to say I'm really, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
I'm excited to be a part of this, and thank you for letting me know, but I don't know who, it's kind of maybe a negative, but being Black myself, and I did teach Negro League baseball at Eastern Michigan University for 9 years, and I refused to have the history department use Negro League as an adjective, because we're not adjectives. And we talk Negro League baseball at Eastern Michigan, we talk Negro League baseball as a topic, sport topic, as individuals, not adjectives. And I also would like to also thank the Petersons for being a part of the doing this here. It excites me, and I do have 2 copies of the book. And I'm taking vacation this week, and I'm taking the book with me because it's time for a reread. And I thank you for exciting me again and giving me this inspiration to go ahead and read it again. And it's just been a pleasure also to know Ted and be a part of Ted's historical piece here. And Donna, hello. We met at the conference this year and had a great meal together. And
we did.
Yes, we did. And to everybody on this Zoom, and also back to Ted. Ted, thank you so much for sending that email out and that email invite. Or I'd be outside doing something right now and sitting here and listening to everybody talking, everybody speaking. It's another inspiration. And I will talk to my daughter, who wants me to start a podcast and put Negro League baseball again, a little piece of Eddie Bedford on the map of Negro League baseball. And everybody, thank you for being a part of this, and especially to Ted and the Petersons for giving us this time on this Saturday morning. Thank you.
I need to add, because Eddie's being a little humble here, he's been a part of Negro League baseball for years and hosted 2 Malloys in suburban Chicago, in Willowbrook, one of which took us to Burr Oak Cemetery in a very moving ceremony there. So thank you, Eddie.
You're welcome.
And if I could just add, thank you to all of you for what you do. It is amazing to me that for example, Eddie teaching courses that deal with the Negro Leagues, and all of you who further the research and the writing, and then also teaching so that the next generations can understand what was unfortunately hidden for a long time, a period of history and a chapter in our country's history.
And also making corrections on some of the material that is out there. When I was teaching class, we had a young lady in class, and they had one of the Negro League ball players out of Detroit, Turkey Stearns, I believe it was, yes. And they had an article in his obituary, and his obituary was incorrect, and his burial site was incorrect. And one of the students in the class said, "Oh no, I know the Stearns very, very well, and that's not correct." And we were able to correct that from the class, and then go and where he was buried, he did not have a stone on. The stone was put in an incorrect place. And all of that was corrected by that one particular student in my class, which is outstanding.
Absolutely.
Can I add to what Mr. Bedford just said, please? The issue of names and family lineage and correct identification of these players, I guess I consider that the most important aspect of this research. It might interest you to know, Mr. Bedford, I just sent 19 pages of corrections to Larry Lester for his new Negro Leagues volume 3. The graveyards were spoken about. There's a lot of abandoned graveyards that were destroyed through gentrification and through the separation of Black neighborhoods from more wealthy areas by just shoving stuff through. Railways being a particular example. There's the decay of the Stones. There's a lot of issues of Black newspapers missing. There are some extant Black newspapers that aren't real happy, I know from my own research, to cooperate if you ask them for genealogical information that I know they've got buried somewhere in their files. And I guess I would encourage everybody here, given to the attendees, to really look carefully at getting these names right. And because a lot of these families are still around, and it really, really means something to these people to have their fathers and their grandfathers and their uncles recognized for what they did. I just thought that was, because of what you said, I just thought that was an important point to push. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, Ted, if I could speak for a minute, I'd just like to thank everybody. I wanted to say that we plan on opening a small museum at Hamtramck Stadium next summer, assuming that construction on the stadium that's going to take place over the winter is finished in time. And one of the exhibits I plan on doing is a badge number for Negro League scholars, like employee badges, because I want people to know who were the pioneers. And of course, Robert Peterson is badge number 1. And as was said earlier by multiple people, the book still reads well. I have 3 editions of it. The first one I got and the first one I read was the same edition that Ted was referring to, the McGraw-Hill edition in '84, but I have 2 other editions that I picked up along the way. And of course, a lot of those early books don't read so well now, so I don't recommend them to non-scholars. But Only the Ball Was White, along with Don Rogerson's book, Invisible Men, which followed in, I believe, '83, still read extremely well. I tell people, if you don't know anything about the Negro Leagues, read one of those 2 books, or preferably read both of them, because while the actual statistics in that might be superseded now, there's nothing about the text that gives you the wrong impression of what it was like. In fact, they give you great insight into what it was like to be in the Negro Leagues. So thank you to the family, and thanks especially to Robert Peterson.
RJ, if that silence is an indication.
You want to give that a shot?
Yeah, I think it's going to work, and any discussion should take place in the chat. So here we go. I hope this is Mr. Peterson after being introduced by Dick Clark back in August of 1998. Aha.
There are probably at least a dozen people in the room who know more about the subject of this conference than I do, because I really haven't done anything about it since the book came out. My book came out in 1970. So I'm going to resist my tendency to pontificate and talk about something unrelated. If that puts me out of the keynote speakers club, that's the way it is. I'll try to entertain you by telling you why and how I researched Only the Ball Was White and how the book was received. Those of you who have done research will, I think, be interested. Those of you who are not researchers, I'll save some time at the end to answer questions about anything even remotely connected to Negro baseball or my work. First, let me say that I believe baseball behind the color line is not just black history, it's American history. It is a relic of an era when black people were segregated by law in the southern states and treated as second-class citizens almost everywhere else. As I say at the end of the first chapter of Only the Ball Was White, Negro baseball was both a gladsome thing and a blot on America's conscience. When I began work on the book, I had no idea that it would help to spawn a cottage industry. I'm absolutely amazed at the level of interest and dedication of the people in the Negro Leagues Committee in the work of this committee. Many of you have gone a long way toward resurrecting Negro baseball from the graveyard of sports history. Today, there is 10 times as much interest in the subject as there was 30 years ago, and probably 30 times as much knowledge about it. I don't claim any credit for the growth because I haven't done any real research on Negro baseball since my book was published. Most of you are quite a bit younger than I am, and perhaps it could benefit from a brief discussion of what life and baseball were like during the 1930s and early 40s when I was young and Negro baseball was in its heyday. I grew up in Warren, PA, Warren, Pennsylvania, a town of 14,000 people in the northwestern corner of the state. There wasn't a single African American in town. I don't know why, because it wasn't really redneck territory. But then several nearby towns, Jamestown, New York, and Bradford, Oil City, and Meadville, Pennsylvania, had black citizens, but Warren did not. Our racism was not the virulent kind that was found in the South in those years. There was no violence perpetrated against black people who were passing through, and I don't recall ever hearing the N-word as a child. I think that by and large, the kids at least, were more oblivious to race than racist. But I do know that black people weren't welcome in public accommodations. When I was working a few years ago on a book about the early days of professional basketball, I interviewed the owner and coach of the Warren Pens, a pro team in the National Basketball League in 1937. He often, or not often, several times, he brought in the Renaissance Big Five, an all-black team from New York City, who were by far the best team in the nation in the 1930s. When they came to our town, Jerry Archibald, the owner and coach, had to arrange for them to go to Jamestown to find hotels because the 2 hotels in Warren would not accommodate them. I played high school basketball against black kids, but I did not know any. Even when I left town to join the Navy during World War II, I did not run into African Americans because black sailors were in segregated units in those days. It wasn't until after the war, when I went to college, that I got to know black people. During my boyhood in the 30s, I was a sports nut, like most kids in small towns. We came home from school, changed clothes, and immediately started a game of whatever sport was in season on a vacant lot. We played until supper time and then went back at it after supper. There were plenty of games to watch, too. In the summer, baseball was played 3 or 4 evenings each week by teams in the aptly named Sunset League. The players were men, not kids, who loved the game so much they came out after work, if they had a job. Remember, this was the Great Depression, to play ball. There was no admission charge, but along about the 5th inning, a guy would visit the bleachers with a tin can, and the spectators would drop whatever they could afford, probably a nickel or dime, into it to pay for baseballs and the umpire. The best Sunset League players made up the Warren semi-pro team. The semi-pros played teams from nearby towns on Saturday and Sunday and maybe earned $5 a game, depending on the gate. When a touring black team came to town, the semi-pros played them too. Those games were generally on weekday evenings because the black clubs scheduled their Negro League games on weekends in the big cities to draw bigger crowds. Sometimes barnstorming black clubs would schedule 2 games on a weekday. I well remember the Homestead Grays playing a twilight game in Warren and then jumping into their bus for an hour-long ride to Olean, New York for a night game. I've been making 2 points with this personal reminiscence. The first is that baseball was king of the sports world during my childhood. College football was pretty big, and a heavyweight fight would cause excitement. But pro football was covered back among the truss ads, and pro basketball was almost invisible, except in a handful of cities on the eastern seaboard and in the Middle West. The second point I've been making is that I knew Negro baseball existed even as a child, because one or two black teams played in my hometown every summer. Not everyone knew it. Larry Ritter, who wrote The Glory of Their Times, possibly the best baseball book ever written, told me that when he was growing up at that time in New York City, he had no idea that black teams were playing in Yankee Stadium when the Yanks were on the road. After World War II, I started college in New Jersey, and during the summers I worked and played semi-pro baseball back home. In 1948, my last year as a semi-pro, I played against the barnstorming Indianapolis Clowns and one other black club. I think they called themselves the Harrisburg Giants, although they were a far cry from the powerhouse Giants of the 1920s. So you might say that I had a part in Negro baseball, albeit a very, very small part. I graduated from college in 1950, and for the next 16 years, I was a reporter and editor on newspapers in New York, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. 2 of the 4 papers I worked on are now defunct. Cause and effect there. I was a news editor on the New York World Telegram when it died in 1966, and I decided to try freelancing for a living. I'm still at it. In the winter of 1966-67, I was working on a short story. The story was set in my memory of a black song and dance man who was a member of a medicine show troupe that played in Warren for a week or so one summer when I was 8 or 9 years old. Chances are some of you have never heard of a medicine show, so I'll explain that it was an outdoor comedy show leading up to a pitch for a cure-all potion. The pitchman would assure the audience that the potion, which no doubt was heavily laced with alcohol, would cure cancer, lumbago, the common cold, and whatever else ails you for $1 a bottle. Our baseball diamond was right next to the field where the medicine show's wagons were set up, and each day this black performer would sit in the bleachers and watch us play. I don't think he ever spoke to us. In any case, 30 years later, I was trying to invent a story about him and his life when I got to thinking about the black teams that had barnstormed through Warren in my youth. It occurred to me that I had never read much of anything about them, so I checked my local library. I found autobiographies of Satchel Paige and Roy Campanella, but there wasn't a whole lot in those books about Negro baseball. Page's book was heavy on Satchel Paige and his droll humor, and Campy's book was mostly about life on the Eli Giants and his major league career. Pretty skimpy stuff for my purposes. So I decided to try to write a book on Negro baseball. I sent a proposal about a book to A.S. Barnes, which at that time published sports books. They rejected the idea, so I sent it to Prentice Hall. Today, Prentice Hall publishes mostly textbooks and reference books, I think. But at that time, it had a big trade book division, too. Prentice Hall liked the idea, and in May 1967, I signed a contract to produce a book in 1 year. I was given an advance on royalties totaling $3,000, $1,500 on signing the contract, $750 when the editor had half the manuscript, and $750 when it was finished. I'll get back to those figures later because they had an effect on the book's content. Now, I have one great advantage over most of you folks who do research. I live less than an hour from the New York Public Library, one of the 3 great research libraries of the world. The ink was barely dry on my book contract before I arrived at the library. There I found one of the rare copies of Saul White's History of Colored Baseball, an invaluable guide to Negro baseball in the 19th century. I also found books by Doc Young and Edwin Bancroft Henderson, both authors of books on black sport. A nearby branch library had nearly complete files of sporting life and the sporting news. Original copies, by the way, not microfilm. They were bound in bound volumes, and the pages were yellowing and brittle, but very readable. Most important for my purposes, in a branch library in Harlem called the Schomburg Collection, I found microfilm of all the major black weekly papers. I spent much of the summer reading this stuff. I was working 30 hours a week on magazine articles to feed my young family, My wife and I had a 10-year-old son and an 8-year-old daughter, and 30 hours on baseball. Over about 4 months, I read all the literature I could find on Negro baseball, the sporting press from 1884 to about 1905, and enough microfilm to cross my eyes. I did not read all of the black press, however. For each year, beginning I think in 1906 and ending about 1952, I would read all the issues from March through November of one of the black weekly papers. Generally, I would cover the Chicago Defender for 1 year, then the Pittsburgh Courier for the next year. Occasionally, I would look for something I was pretty sure appeared in the Afro-American or the New York Age, but the Defender and Courier were my chief sources. Here's a tip for an ambitious and tireless researcher. Read all the major black weeklies for every year, and you can produce a book that is much richer in detail than Only the Ball Was White. By the fall of 1967, I had notes for every year from 1885 to 1950, an index card for each player I found mentioned, and a fairly good idea of where Only the Ball Was White was going. Now I was ready to flesh out my story with some oral history. All I had to do was locate some old players and arrange to interview them. Piece of cake, right? Today, if I wanted to find the 100-odd survivors of the old Negro Leagues, I could probably do it in a couple of hours just by talking to folks in this room. That was far from the case in 1967. It seemed that when the Negro Leagues expired for good in 1960, everybody, even the players, forgot about Negro baseball and by and large lost touch with one another. I knew that Roy Campanella had a liquor store in Harlem, so I visited him there. I wasn't especially interested in interviewing him because he had written about his experience with the Eli Giants in his book, It's Good to Be Alive. Campy wasn't hostile when I explained my mission, but he wasn't particularly helpful either. But he did tell me that Buck Leonard was alive and well in Rocky Mount, North Carolina, and that Judy Johnson was a scout for the Phillies. I wrote to them and followed up with phone calls to arrange for interviews. One of Judy Johnson's best friends was Bill Yancey, who lived near Philadelphia, so I got his address and checked him. I visited Bill twice that fall, once to interview him about his life and once to arrange to borrow photos from his fairly extensive collection. Probably a third of the photos of individual players in Only the Ball Was White came from team photos belonging to Yancey. I also visited Delaware to interview Judy Johnson in North Carolina to see Buck Leonard. Marvelous men and marvelous interviews. Incidentally, I was very well received by all the old players and widows I visited. They were most courteous and most willing to help me. I located most of my interviewees piecemeal. That is, one old player would know the whereabouts of another one or two, and that one would tell me about another one or two. I can't recall how, but somehow I learned about an organization called the Old Ball Players Club of Chicago. That organization put me in touch with several old-timers and widows in Chicago, making it feasible financially for me to make a trip, since I would be able to interview 6 or 7 over 2 days. I was constantly trying to make such package deals to save money, but I couldn't always do it. Early on, I had the address of Cool Papa Bell in St. Louis, but I couldn't afford to visit him because I knew of no other players in St. Louis, and one wasn't enough to justify the trip. I did make an exception in the case of Satchel Paige, but to the surprise of no one who knows Satchel, he wasn't home in Kansas City on the date he had arranged to see me. I finally finished the manuscript in September 1969, a year and a half late. Earlier, I mentioned that my advance on royalties had an effect on the book's contents. Now I'll tell you why. Anyone who looks at Only the Ball Was White with a critical eye will realize that the narrative stops rather abruptly. After I got Jackie Robinson into the major leagues, I kissed off the remaining years of Negro baseball in short order. I have about 4 pages for the eventful years from 1945, when scores of African Americans were going into organized baseball and the Negro Leagues were going down the tubes. The reason was simple. I had been working on this book non-stop for several months, and I needed the last $750 to pay the bills. It was a clear case of commerce triumphing over art. The book was published in May 1970. It got generally respectful reviews, but it was no blockbuster. Jim Bouton's Ball 4 came out at the same time and was far and away more popular, probably deservedly so, since Ball 4 was the first of the tell-all sports biographies. Only the Ball Was White was excerpted for newspaper syndication, and after Satchel Paige was elected to the Hall of Fame in 1971, the book got me assignments for stories on Negro baseball from the New York Times Magazine, Boy's Life, and a couple of other magazines. I also was corresponding with a number of people who were turned on to the subject by my book. Some of them may be here today. Over the next couple of years, Prentice Hall considered but rejected the idea of putting out a paperback edition. They also tried to auction paperback rights to other publishers, but there were no takers. Prentice Hall turned down my proposals for a biography of Josh Gibson and a book of biographical sketches of the first 4 or 5 men named to the Hall of Fame from the Negro Leagues. Only the Ball Was White went out of print in 1976. Total sales of the hardcover have been, I think, around 8,000. Like many other publishers then, Prentice Hall was not very forthcoming with precise numbers, but I know that 4,850 were sold at the full price, and I'm guessing that around 3,000 were sold at discounts of 50% or more. About the time the book went out of print, I sent a proposal to 12 publishers for a sequel covering the early years of baseball's integration and the demise of the Negro Leagues. No takers. For that story, we had to wait for Jules Teigel's excellent Baseball's Great Experiment some years later. In 1981, I pitched the idea for a paperback reprint to 13 publishers and struck out. By that time, John Holway had 2 or 3 books in print. William Brashler had published his biography of Josh Gibson, and Teigel's book and Don Ragosin's Invisible Men were just around the corner. Interest was growing in the subject of Negro baseball, and in 1984, my book finally went into a paperback edition by McGraw-Hill. They dropped it 3 or 4 years later, and since 1991, Only the Ball Was White has been an Oxford University Press paperback. I've talked a lot about myself and my experiences with the book. Now let's broaden the perspective and consider what Negro baseball meant, not just to African Americans, but to Americans of every race and creed. I've already touched a bit about that on what it was like, what it meant to small town fans, at least in the North. It was very important to us because Negro baseball showed us some talented athletes who happened to be black, but whose blackness was not their most striking attribute. Their athletic skill was. In short, black teams showed us that African Americans were not shuffling fools as they were often portrayed on the stage and in the movies of those days. Therefore, they broadened our understanding of America. What did a Negro baseball mean to African Americans? Obviously, the men on the player panel to follow me can address that question better than I can. But my impression is that Negro baseball was second only to the black church as a linchpin of black America. The teams were loyally supported. A big ball game was a social occasion as well as an athletic contest, and some folks dressed to the nines when they went to the ballpark. Some teams had fan clubs and opened the season with a parade and maybe a fashion show. The last all-black teams were dying about the time Only the Ball Was White was published. All the major league teams had long been integrated. Even in the Deep South, most minor league teams had black players. And not incidentally, those players suffered the same kind of abuse that Jackie Robinson had endured in 1946 and 47. I do not mourn the demise of Negro baseball, even though I agree with those who point out that black communities lost something when black baseball expired. I do not agree with those who think it would have been better if the white leagues had simply absorbed the all-black teams with no attempt at integration. I think that Jackie Robinson, Larry Doby, Monty Irvin, Roy Campanella, and the other black pioneers in big league baseball played a major role as harbingers of the civil rights movement. I well remember that after Robinson's triumphant year with the Montreal Royals in 1946, My college psychology professor remarked that Robinson's success as an exciting ball player and a man of extraordinary courage would do more for race relations than any number of sermons and well-intentioned admonitions. I believe that to this day. If you remember one thing about this little talk, let it be an understanding that Negro baseball and its passing are not just black history. They are American history. And those of you who are resurrecting that history are doing a service to all Americans, not just African Americans. When I started talking, I told you that those of you who aren't much interested in research and writing, that you'd get a shot at me later about things that interest you about Negro baseball. So if you have any questions, I'll do my best to answer them, and if I can't, I'm sure there are people in the room who can. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Did you ever get to interview Page, or you never?
Yes, I did, but no, after the book was out.
After the book.
I went to his induction, and he was very effusive. He even recognized my name, and when he was introduced to me, and was very, oh, this is the guy who wrote the book. But I never saw him before, and I never saw him play, interestingly enough. He wasn't around Pittsburgh when I was growing up. Yes, sir.
Mr. Peters.
Yes, sir.
For years, I've tried to come up with a more catchier title in your book. How did you come up with that title, Only the Ball is White?
Well, it started, it isn't really accurate when you think about it, because I think most black teams, at least in the North, played the majority of their games against white, semi-pro whites. So it isn't really accurate. It started out as a chapter title on the Negro Leagues. My outline, I titled each chapter, and the chapter that was
At the end of the tape, Ted?
No more questions.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for playing that. That was fascinating.
One more to go.
Okay.
Wow. Oh.
Ted, is it okay if I turn the recording off?
If I'd like to keep it for the record, but
Oh, okay.
you're the
Okay.
boss.
I'll leave it on. All right. Well, yeah, you mentioned earlier trying to get those on the SABR page for the 1998 conference, and that would be a great thing to have out there. I agree. Anything else anyone wants to say on the record before we?
Well, I want to thank everybody for showing up. I think this was a marvelous 90 minutes, and now I got to go eat lunch.
All righty. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to turn the recording off now. So thank you for your patience.